I have spent my entire academic career analyzing how great powers rise, compete, and ultimately decline when they overreach beyond their capabilities, but I never anticipated witnessing a nuclear superpower commit such a brazen act of economic self destruction in pursuit of a war it cannot win. On November 19th, Russian media revealed what many of us in the national security community had suspected but hoped was not true. Russia's central bank has begun systematically offloading gold reserves from the National Wealth Fund, a vault that was supposed to remain untouched except in cases of genuine national catastrophe. As I read the reports from my office at the University of Chicago, I understood immediately that this was not routine financial management or clever economic diversification, as the Kremlin claimed. This was desperation dressed as strategy, a confession written in gold sales that Russia can no longer afford the war. Putin started 4 years ago. The National Wealth Fund occupies a sacred place in Russian economic doctrine, created not for military adventures, but as a lifeline for society during true crisis moments when the state must protect its citizens from collapse. For generations, Russian leaders understood that this fund represented the final backstop, the emergency reserve that would only be tapped when the nation itself faced existential peril. Putin himself spent years obsessively hoarding gold in massive quantities, building what he believed was an impregnable economic fortress that would insulate Russia from Western pressure. He glorified gold as the foundation of Russian economic strength, accumulating reserves that made Russia one of the largest gold holders on earth. Yet now, the war he launched to restore Russian greatness is forcing him to auction off that very foundation just to keep his military machine grinding forward another few weeks. The central bank's justification for these sales is wrapped in technical language about market liquidity and portfolio diversification, but these explanations collapse under scrutiny. They claim they are simply mirroring previous operations with the Chinese yuan, but this deliberately obscures the fundamental issue. This gold belongs to the National Wealth Fund, not to general reserves available for routine operations. The Kremlin is stripping bare a fund specifically designed to protect society during genuine emergencies, not to bankroll a war of choice that Putin initiated and refuses to end despite mounting evidence that Russia lacks the economic capacity to sustain it. In my theoretical framework of offensive realism, I have always emphasized that great powers must accurately assess their own capabilities and match their ambitions to their resources. Putin has catastrophically failed this basic test of statecraft. The symbolism cuts deeper than the immediate financial implications. Russia once held more than 405 tons of gold in the National Wealth Fund. Today, that figure has collapsed to just 173 tons. Russia has sold over half, 232 tons gone, liquidated to fund a war that was supposed to be finished years ago. At current gold prices, that equals approximately $30 billion, which sounds like a mountain of money until you understand that Russia burns through hundreds of millions or even $1 billion each day prosecuting this war. Those billions buy, at best, a few extra weeks of fighting, a temporary reprieve that does nothing to address the fundamental strategic disaster Putin has created. A once mighty power has been reduced to selling its emergency gold reserves for scraps of time on the battlefield. What makes this situation particularly revealing is that Putin did not have to make this choice. When he launched his invasion in February 2022, he believed the world would witness a rapid, triumphant campaign that would restore Russia's position as a dominant force in European affairs. He expected Kiev to fall within days, perhaps weeks at worst. David Petraeus noted that China was told this was just a small special operation, a few days to topple the government and go home to a victory parade. But 4 years later, the war grinds on relentlessly, bleeding Russia dry month after month, while Ukraine, backed by sustained Western military aid, continues to resist. The conflict Putin expected to end quickly has instead become an open wound that drains Russian power with no end in sight. The deeper I examine this situation, the more clearly I see the classic pattern of a declining power making increasingly desperate choices as it tries to sustain ambitions that exceed its material capabilities. Russia's budget deficit has ballooned to catastrophic levels, exceeding $50 billion in just the first 10 months of 2025. Revenues have barely increased, while expenditures have exploded by over 15% as the war machine demands constant feeding. Russia earned roughly $369 billion, but spent more than $421 billion. The country is hemorrhaging money. Oil revenues, once the lifeblood of the Russian state, can no longer plug the gap because Ukraine's relentless strikes on refineries have crippled Russia's fuel infrastructure, and Western sanctions have hammered major energy giants. Oil income is down 27% year over year. This is precisely why Putin has been forced to break the sacred seal on the National Wealth Fund. There is simply no other choice left. But in doing so, he has torn down another critical barrier that protected Russian economic stability. The fund was designed to grow automatically when oil prices exceed a certain threshold, with extra revenues skimmed off and saved for future needs. But oil prices have remained weak for years, which means the fund has been shrinking while no new money flows in to replenish it. Putin is draining a reservoir that cannot refill itself, systematically destroying one of Russia's last economic lifelines to buy temporary extensions for a war that grows more unsustainable by the day. What troubles me most is not just the immediate economic damage Putin is inflicting on Russia, but the broader geopolitical implications of watching a nuclear-armed great power hollow itself out in pursuit of an unwinnable war. In my work, I have always emphasized that the international system is anarchic, meaning no higher authority exists to constrain state behavior or guarantee survival. In such a system, states must carefully husband their resources and match their ambitions to their capabilities, because miscalculation can be catastrophic. Putin has violated every principle of prudent statecraft. He launched a war based on faulty intelligence about Ukrainian resistance and Western resolve. He failed to prepare his economy for sustained conflict. And now, trapped by his own decisions and unable to admit failure, he is systematically cannibalizing Russia's economic foundation. Even more telling is where much of the gold Russia is selling appears to be going to Russian citizens themselves. Russia's Deputy Minister of Finance acknowledged that domestic demand for gold has skyrocketed as ordinary Russians, terrified of losing what wealth they have left, flee into the supposed safety of precious metals. When fear grips a population to this extent, when citizens no longer trust their government or their currency and instead hoard physical gold as protection against chaos, it signals a profound loss of confidence in the state itself. Russians have purchased hundreds of tons of gold since 2022, so much that their private holdings now match the entire national reserves of Spain. The irony is devastating. Putin built his legitimacy on promises of stability and strength, yet his war has generated such uncertainty that Russians are preparing for potential collapse. The war's economic toll extends far beyond gold sales and budget deficits. Analysts confirm Russia has endured 3 straight years of spending bursts, averaging around 10% of its entire economy, an unsustainable pace for any nation, let alone one choking under comprehensive Western sanctions. That kind of spending should be reserved for productive investments in infrastructure, education, technology, or industrial modernization. Instead, Russia is burning through billions per month on a war that destroys value, kills its youth, consumes military equipment faster than it can be replaced, and drives away the foreign investment and technical expertise the country desperately needs. From the perspective of great power competition, this is economic suicide, the willful destruction of the very foundations of national power in pursuit of territorial gains that Russia cannot digest, even if it somehow manages to conquer them. The taboo Putin has broken becomes even clearer when we examine what the National Wealth Fund was actually designed to support: pensions, health care, infrastructure, education, social safety nets. Putin is raiding the fund meant to protect society in order to sustain a military quagmire that serves no genuine national security interest. This is not defensive war fighting against an existential threat. This is offensive aggression that has backfired catastrophically, and rather than cutting his losses and seeking a negotiated settlement, Putin is doubling down repeatedly, throwing good money after bad. But great power politics does not work this way. Victory does not automatically flow from demographic advantage when your economy cannot sustain the war effort and your population increasingly questions why they are sacrificing so much for goals that seem disconnected from their actual security needs. Russia's economic growth, which briefly inflated due to massive wartime spending, is now evaporating as the temporary stimulus effects wear off and the structural damage becomes undeniable. Russia is facing contractions reminiscent of past economic crises. Growth has collapsed to near zero, and some economists warn it may slide into outright recession despite the government pumping enormous sums into military production. The engine that once powered Russian development is sputtering, and selling gold cannot repair fundamental problems like brain drain, capital flight, technological isolation, and massive inefficiencies created by a war economy divorced from market signals. What remains of the National Wealth Fund will not last long if current spending patterns continue. Russia is literally eating its own future to prolong a war that was supposed to be easy. I find myself returning to a question that has haunted great power scholarship for centuries. Why do states persist in destructive policies long after it becomes clear those policies are failing? The rational choice would be for Putin to negotiate a settlement, declare some version of victory based on territorial gains in Donbass, and shift focus to rebuilding Russia's economy and military for future competition. But great powers, especially those led by personalist autocrats whose legitimacy depends on projections of strength, often find it psychologically and politically impossible to admit mistakes or accept outcomes that look like defeat. Putin has staked his legacy on this war. Having created this narrative, he cannot easily back away from it without appearing weak, and in the brutal logic of authoritarian politics, appearing weak can be fatal. This dynamic creates what I call the trap of sunk costs in great power conflict. The more a state invests in a failing policy, the harder it becomes to change course, because doing so would require admitting that all previous sacrifices were wasted. Putin has now committed so much to Ukraine that retreating would not just mean losing territory, it would mean admitting his entire strategic vision was flawed, that hundreds of thousands of Russians died for nothing, that hundreds of billions of dollars were squandered, that Russia's international isolation and economic damage were self-inflicted wounds. For an autocrat who has built his image around strength and strategic genius, such an admission would be devastating. So instead, he continues to escalate commitment, selling off gold reserves, conscripting more soldiers, sacrificing more of Russia's future in a desperate attempt to avoid confronting the magnitude of his failure. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is that declining powers often become more aggressive, not less, as they feel their relative position slipping away. This is the dark insight at the heart of offensive realism. When states perceive themselves as losing power relative to rivals, they sometimes launch desperate gambles to reverse their decline before it becomes irreversible. Putin launched this war in part because he saw a closing window of opportunity, but the war itself has dramatically accelerated Russian decline, creating a vicious cycle where each month of fighting further weakens Russia while strengthening NATO and deepening Western unity. What was supposed to be a strategic masterstroke that restored Russian influence has instead become a historic blunder that will haunt Russia for generations. The international reaction to Russia's economic desperation has been equally revealing. China, which many analysts expected to provide Russia with an economic lifeline, has instead kept its distance, unwilling to risk its own economic interests by too closely associating with Putin's failing venture. David Petraeus noted that China was fairly ambivalent about the Russian invasion, especially as it dragged out. China had substantial economic relationships with Ukraine, major plans for Belt and Road initiatives there, and important agricultural imports from the region. All of that had to be put on hold when Putin invaded, and Beijing was clearly not pleased, having presumably been told this was just a small operation that would be over in days. Now, watching Russia hemorrhage gold and economic strength, Chinese leaders are making careful calculations about how much to support a declining power whose strategic position continues to deteriorate. This brings me to one of the most important aspects of this crisis. Russia's desperation is reshaping the entire global balance of power in ways Putin never intended. He launched this war believing it would demonstrate Russian strength, fracture Western unity, and establish Russia as an indispensable power broker. Instead, as Petraeus put it, Putin set out to make Russia great again, but what he has really done is make NATO great again. Finland and Sweden joined NATO directly because of Putin's aggression. Germany reversed 70 years of pacifist foreign policy and committed to massive rearmament. European defense spending has surged. American leadership of the Western alliance has been reinvigorated. China increasingly views Russia as a junior partner whose economic weakness makes it dependent on Chinese goodwill rather than an equal partner in reshaping global order. The gold sales from the National Wealth Fund represent more than just a financial transaction. They are a visible marker of Russia's transformation from a great power that shaped events to a declining power struggling desperately to sustain policies it can no longer afford. In the theoretical literature on power transitions, this is precisely the pattern that worries me most. A declining state that refuses to adjust its ambitions to its diminished capabilities, that continues to act as if it possesses resources and influence it no longer has, and that makes increasingly reckless gambles in a futile attempt to arrest its decline. History teaches us that such states often drag the world into catastrophic conflicts as they thrash about trying to preserve status they have already lost. What particularly concerns me is that Russia remains a nuclear-armed power even as its conventional capabilities and economic foundations crumble. This creates a uniquely dangerous situation where Putin may come to view nuclear weapons as the only remaining source of leverage he possesses. As Russia grows weaker in every other dimension of power, the temptation to rely on nuclear threats to compensate for conventional weakness may grow stronger. This is precisely the scenario that keeps strategic planners awake at night, not a confident, powerful Russia that rationally calculates costs and benefits, but a weakened, desperate Russia led by a man who has already demonstrated catastrophically poor judgment and who may see nuclear escalation as his last remaining option to avoid humiliation. The domestic political implications within Russia are equally concerning. Social programs are already being cannibalized to pay soldier bonuses and recruitment incentives. Regions are cutting welfare spending to redirect funds to military needs. The state is sacrificing its own people's well-being on the altar of a war they never asked for and increasingly do not understand. Putin has managed to maintain public support through propaganda, repression, and the rally around the flag effect. But that support is not infinitely elastic. As the economic pain deepens, as more families lose sons and fathers, as the promised quick victory recedes into an indefinite future, the political compact between Putin and the Russian people will face increasing strain. No amount of state television propaganda can fully obscure the reality that Russian living standards are declining, and the future looks bleaker than before the war began. The intellectual challenge this situation poses for scholars like myself is profound. I have long argued that great powers inevitably compete for dominance and that the international system's anarchic structure creates powerful incentives for states to maximize their relative power. But I have also emphasized that successful great powers must be strategic in how they compete, carefully selecting which contests to engage in and ensuring they possess the resources to prevail. Putin has violated these principles at every turn. He picked a fight he was not prepared to win. He misjudged both his own capabilities and his adversary's resolve. He failed to build the economic and military foundations necessary for sustained great power competition. And now, rather than learning from these mistakes, he is compounding them by draining Russia's last economic reserves in a desperate attempt to avoid admitting failure. What we are witnessing is not just a failed military campaign or a misguided foreign policy adventure. We are watching in real time as a great power systematically destroys its own foundations of national strength in pursuit of gains that are not worth the cost and likely not achievable regardless of the resources committed. Russia's decision to sell gold from the National Wealth Fund is a confession that the war can no longer be sustained through normal economic means. It is an admission that oil revenues are insufficient, that budget deficits are unmanageable, that the Russian economy is too weak to support Putin's ambitions. Most fundamentally, it is proof that Russia is no longer functioning as a great power in any meaningful sense, but rather as a declining regional power that is rapidly consuming the last vestiges of strength accumulated in better times. The tragedy is that this outcome was entirely avoidable. Russia did not have to launch this war. Ukraine posed no genuine threat to Russian security. NATO expansion, while certainly unwelcome from Moscow's perspective, did not justify a massive invasion that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives and hundreds of billions of dollars. Putin chose this path based on catastrophic miscalculations about Ukrainian weakness, Western division, and Russian strength. Every step of the way, he had opportunities to change course, to seek diplomatic solutions, to cut losses and preserve Russia's position. But at each decision point, he chose escalation over prudence, pride over pragmatism, and fantasy over reality. The result is a Russia that is weaker today than it was in 2022, and far weaker than it would have been had Putin simply maintained the status quo. The sale of National Wealth Fund gold represents a crossing of the Rubicon in Russian economic policy. Once a government begins raiding its emergency reserves to fund current operations, it becomes very difficult to stop because the underlying fiscal problems only worsen as reserves deplete. Russia is now caught in a downward spiral where selling gold provides temporary relief but does nothing to address the fundamental imbalance between revenues and expenditures. As the fund shrinks, Russia's ability to weather future shocks diminishes, making the country more vulnerable to external pressures and internal instability. This is not a sustainable trajectory. Something will have to give. Either Putin will be forced to scale back the war effort dramatically, or Russia will face an even more severe economic crisis as its last financial buffers are exhausted. From my perspective, as a scholar who has dedicated his career to understanding how great powers rise and fall, what Russia is doing represents a textbook case of self-inflicted decline. History is filled with examples of states that overreached and paid catastrophic prices. Napoleon's Russia campaign destroyed the Grande Armée and began France's decline from European dominance. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union ultimately doomed Nazi Germany. America's Vietnam and Iraq wars damaged American credibility and consumed resources that could have been invested in addressing rising challenges. Now, Putin's Ukraine war is joining this inglorious list of strategic disasters that weakened rather than strengthened the powers that launched them. The difference is that we are watching this one unfold in real time, with economic data and casualty figures providing a running tally of the destruction. The question that haunts me is whether Putin can recognize the trap he has created and find a way out before Russia's decline becomes irreversible. The rational course would be to seek a negotiated settlement that allows both sides to claim some version of success and ends the hemorrhaging of Russian power. But rationality in foreign policy requires the ability to update beliefs based on new evidence, to admit when policies are failing, and to prioritize national interests over personal pride. These are not characteristics Putin has demonstrated throughout this conflict. Instead, he has consistently escalated commitment in the face of failure, betting that Russia's greater size and higher tolerance for casualties will eventually grind Ukraine into submission. The gold sales from the National Wealth Fund suggest that bet is not paying off. What makes this situation so dangerous is that Putin may conclude his only options are escalation or humiliation, and faced with that choice, he will choose escalation every time. This is the nightmare scenario for those of us who study great power conflict. A leader who has invested too much to back down but lacks the resources to prevail, who faces domestic political consequences if he admits failure, and who controls a nuclear arsenal that could serve as an instrument of desperation if conventional options are exhausted. Russia's economic crisis, symbolized by the pillaging of the National Wealth Fund, is not just a financial problem. It is a strategic crisis that makes Russian behavior less predictable and potentially more dangerous as Putin's options narrow and his desperation grows. The ultimate irony is that Putin's war, launched ostensibly to make Russia great again and restore its position as a dominant power, has instead accomplished exactly the opposite. Russia is weaker today in almost every measurable dimension than it was in 2022. Its military has been severely degraded. Its economy is hemorrhaging money and forced to raid emergency reserves. Its international isolation has deepened. Its demographic crisis has worsened as hundreds of thousands fled and hundreds of thousands more died or were wounded. Its technological development has been set back years. Its energy leverage over Europe has been permanently broken. In every respect, the war has damaged Russia far more severely than any policy NATO could have imposed from outside. The National Wealth Fund gold sales will be remembered by historians as the moment when even the Kremlin could no longer hide that the war had broken Russia economically, that the reserves meant for genuine emergencies were being consumed for a disaster of Putin's own making, and that the dream of restored Russian greatness had become a nightmare of accelerated Russian decline. Putin set out to demonstrate Russian power and instead has presided over its systematic destruction. He set out to weaken NATO and instead has reinvigorated it. He set out to divide the West and instead has unified it. He set out to secure Russia's future and instead has mortgaged it to sustain an unwinnable war. The gold flowing out of the National Wealth Fund is not just a financial transaction. It is the visible evidence of a great power's collapse, the measurable proof that Russia can no longer afford the war its leader refuses to end.